What if the most unsettling truth isn't that you die one day, but that you can never truly die at all? Imagine dying physically and then being reborn into a different body. This would make you immortal. You'd never really die because you'd exist as everybody who could possibly exist. Most reasonable people would say that you can't ever know what happens after death. And anybody who claims they do know what happens after death is either delusional or a charlatan. They would claim that whatever's beyond death or happens at death is unknowable. But this is the claim of this video. Reincarnation is real, and there's a logic behind it that I can prove to you. This logic isn't mystical. It's mathematical. It's physical. It just makes sense. And once you understand it, you can never unsee it. This changes fundamentally how you relate to reality and your understanding of yourself. It also guides you with a sense of peace to understand your place in the world and what it really means and does not mean to be alive. First of all, let's acknowledge that if reincarnation is true, this would be very disturbing for most humans to believe. It is disturbing for human minds because we are most afraid of losing ourselves. So, because of this, death in of itself already is super disturbing. It is the primal fear that drives everything that we have done in society. And everyone tries to find their own ways to cope with it. A lot use the idea of heaven or infinite nothingness to cope. I personally was super afraid of death. And when I stopped believing in heaven, as I was still very much in my religious programming, I actually noticed how horrifying it must be to not exist, to have no afterlife at all. It sounds so scary to be like in a void of nothingness for all eternity. But then over time I also realized that, this also is kind of good news, right? If heaven isn't real, well then hell isn't real either. And there's enough suffering in this world anyway. So wow, if we die, we truly are free from all of the suffering. So endless nothingness actually doesn't sound so bad. But while I was in the process of befriending myself with the idea of death being nothing at all, the atheistic notion of endless nothingness kind of stopped making sense. And I needed to let go of this sense of peace I got from this way of conceptualizing death. Because I shockingly realized that even this was another tricky way of the mind to produce wishful thinking. It's the idea that death is endless nothing that humans actually cling to, especially modern humans, and they build their entire life around this understanding of reality. It gives you the ability to be amoral so that you don't really have to care about some judgment after life. And once you believe that there can't possibly be a judgment after life, which is like the normal materialist atheist thing to assume, well then of course it also changes how you approach your entire life. And it kind of limits you in how you see what reality is like. I started to see that afterlife, or the afterlife, might actually be the thing that I was afraid of all along. This is really the scary proposition. It's that life never stops, not that there's an end to it. Because if I get reborn, who knows what cosmic horrors can await me next? There's a deep, deep fear about the unknown because the unknown can be quite brutal and cruel. I also want you to notice that you might think any of this, like this entire conversation here, is pointless because you never really can know what death is. Like there's this deep, almost knowing or self-assuredness about not being able to know what death is. And this assumption also runs very deep. Because we think if we could truly figure out scientifically what it means to die, well then we would know it by now, right? But can you see how arrogant this is? Can you see how arrogant society is in regards to these topics? Because we barely have created the internet, and AI is also something completely new to us. We don't really understand what consciousness at all, but then make the assumptions that, all of this afterlife stuff, it is unknowable. It doesn't exist. It's just all mythological babble. So there's no point to think about these things at all anymore. So what we do is we silence and reject anybody who claims they have had some experience of death before. We don't take old mystic texts seriously, and we don't take ego death or near-death experience seriously at all. We assume that you are either logical or you believe in religious superstitions. So the moment somebody says something that might sound very mystical, like reincarnation is real, we immediately put them into the category of people who just don't know what they're talking about, and they've lost contact with reality. Which shows how much bias there actually is in scientific thinking, how much bias there is in rationality, where if it gets too out of the box, then we immediately want to put it back into the box again, because it's actually very threatening to our conceptions of reality. All these assumptions are therefore very dangerous to make, limiting our scientific progress. You can't know what happens after death if you instinctively dismiss the ability that you could know. All technological, societal, and scientific breakthroughs always came from a new wave of open-mindedness. If we want to take a scientific lens, our current assumptions about nothing happening after death also isn't scientific at all. Believing in nothing after death is the same unfounded assumption that all religious people do, just that for whatever reason you think you can be sure about that, just because you have not witnessed it. A very common thought experiment I hear too is, try to remember what it was like before your birth. And then you try to imagine it, and it's impossible, right? You only think about, there's nothing that can possibly come up. And then they say, that's what death must be like. But this thought experiment actually undermines itself. You can only imagine nothing while being conscious of something. True nothingness can't be experienced, because experience itself contradicts nothingness. So what you're actually just doing is you're just imagining how it's like not to exist while you exist. It is a pointless exercise. Death in this way of nothingness you're proposing doesn't exist. I have no memory from before I was born, but to assume that what death is like ignores that I can only make this thought experience because I'm alive. So what I'm actually doing is I'm simply acknowledging how it's like to be alive imagining death. You have to experience something to actually know what it's like. And why would you conclude nothingness as some ultimate destiny if you've ever never witnessed nothingness? The concept of ultimate nothingness doesn't make any sense. And here's where the rationality becomes deeply disturbing. Because if you look into your present experience, you can see that you are actually undeniable evidence that nothing can't exist. It is impossible for truly absolute nothingness to exist. Because you exist. Your existence proves absolute nothingness is impossible. Even if you were to die now, nothingness is already impossible because somethingness was proven by you. You can't make what has already happened unhappen. So even a second of existence proves infinity. All you need for immortality is the endless potential for existence. And without any mystical superstition, you can verify that experience never can stop forever. It just doesn't make sense. You understand intuitively that it doesn't matter what happens to your body. This world keeps moving on. So clearly reality doesn't depend on anybody being alive. So why make the actual super counterintuitive assumption that once you die, the entire universe kind of stops forever, like from your point of view? It is completely contradictory to everything that you've actually witnessed in your lifetime. It's also not how life interacts with itself. Our entire purpose is survival and procreation. We create children and families and love them and want them to flourish because they move beyond us. Any sense of purpose and virtue we have is always that which moves beyond the individual self, beyond our personal biases. And it's also how nature completely acts on its own, the way flowers bloom despite entropy, and how they share their own seeds so that the forest can flourish. Everything in the universe is in a movement from one state to another, communicating with other things that keep moving and multiplying themselves. Why do you assume that when you die, this movement stops. And when you stop being fooled by modern society's belief systems and your own ego's desire for self-preservation, this all starts to slowly seem quite obvious. Obvious to a point that it makes more sense to at least assume that your death is just another stage of transition. Not that different than any other movement in the universe. But to go a step further, is there actually a way to experience death, to verify this, like, directly? When we look at near-death experiences, deep meditative absorption, or ego death on psychedelics, we can see that people have profound experiences that pretty much relate to each other, and they show the same themes over and over again. They come back from this experience of near death, and they report that they are certain they have died, and now they've come back. And then they report their own experience going through the process. And of course, there's a lot of skepticism that has to come up, because how could you possibly verify what they've gone through and what it really means? But independent of this, these stories are fascinating. They are really fascinating because they map onto a lot of stuff that old mystic texts have said since forever. They also point to what psychedelic experience might tell you, like this unity of consciousness and this unity of experience and this unity of self. And this is not something that you can find like once or twice. Like there are so many reports throughout history about these experiences. And to not take them into account and take them seriously seems to be like a grave mistake. At least as a point of investigation or questioning, they should still be there for discussion. These experiences are vastly different from person to person, and they can sound very much like an intense dream or like a DMT trip. But there are a lot of themes that become quite common, from feeling to be pulled into light, from being greeted by old friends in a familiar realm, or feelings of déjà vu. And the most common one, and I think also most important one, is the sense of immense amount of love and understanding. This love and understanding part is really the thing that shocks people so much, both in DMT experiences, both in near-death experiences, because it's such a complete and overwhelming understanding of reality that when you come back to your normal human life, there's just no way to dismiss that. Like it changes something in the people who have gone through it. So, well, of course, we can acknowledge that it can't be physical death if they came back to talk about it, right? Even though clinically, like, their biological body stops functioning, somehow they came back. So there might still be the skeptic part of you that says, okay, it's not actually that they've come back from the dead. But you will always say that as long as people come back from the dead. So whenever somebody reports, yeah, I've had a death-like experience, and you say, no, but you're alive, so it's not possible, it cannot possibly be a death-like experience, well, by your definition, it's actually impossible to die. It's not something that you could possibly have access to, because the moment you have access to it, you start to deny it. And I think this is the tricky trap that we do, to deny how big and much greater reality is than ourselves. So your scientific temperament ignores the truth that is staring in your face. The scientific validation is found in the direct experience of the now. Nothingness is the same as everything. You are a part of everything, therefore you can't be separated. And you only need to look around you. Everything in nature operates in these cycles. Water evaporates, forms clouds, then rain falls from these clouds back into the ocean, just to evaporate again. Stars are born from cosmic dust, live for billions of years, then explode, and form the seeds to form new stars. The same with plants that grow, die, decompose, and then nourish new life forms. Nothing in nature simply stops existing. All transforms. So, why the hell do you think it makes more sense to assume that your death is the only thing that is not transformation? Why would consciousness be the only thing that breaks this omnipresent pattern? This leads to this inescapable conclusion. What you call you is a temporary configuration, but consciousness itself is eternal. When your body dies, consciousness continues elsewhere, in new forms and new experiences. The you that is perceiving this will dissolve, like the identity that you have formed, but awareness itself cannot. The question then becomes, what makes you you? Is it your memories, your specific neural patterns, or is it simply the fact of being consciousness at all? Because if consciousness is fundamental and not an emergent property, but a basic aspect of reality like space or time, then you are less like a specific person and more like a specific expression of a universal phenomenon. Your brain makes up a concept of dying that then creates fear because it doesn't want to lose its finite identity. It's what it needs to do to survive. But this idea of death that we humans have access to, it's always a concept. And each person conceptualizes it differently. It's, of course, impossible to say who is truly right or wrong if they've not crossed the line, because we are alive after all. But clearly some ideas are more logical than others. The idea that reality exists and works independent of our bodies and our consciousness or individual consciousness, and that consciousness is a universal phenomenon independent of your life or your death, is just simply logical. The same forces in the universe that made you be a person and get born into this world, why would they disappear? They can't disappear. It's just almost like a law because it had the potential to have happened. And many wise people and cultures throughout history have believed this very reality. It makes more sense to think about consciousness like an ocean and individual minds as temporary waves. Then you are both less and more than you thought, because the wave returns into the ocean again, and then the ocean continues to form new waves for all eternity. This idea is also called open individualism. So you start to look at strangers on the street not as just some other people, but you gain a deep understanding that whenever you talk to anybody or anything that is alive, you're talking to another version of yourself. And to really believe that is insane. There's a lot of reason that your mind or your psyche, if this is true, will not accept it or wants to accept it. Once you really start to get the depth of what I'm saying here, you'll start to notice how many implications there is for you, even while you are alive. Like, it is not just some comfortable or uncomfortable belief after you die. It creates a bunch of disturbing consequences for you right here, right now, because this means that everyone is you. Everything is real as you are real. So there's nothing that happens to anybody that is not also happening to you. To really see this as truth and experience it in your body for the first time, it's madness. It's scary and shocking beyond belief. You suddenly might fear every bit of suffering that is out there in the entire universe, and you own it as yours. Countless lives being killed and tortured, endless amounts of bliss and beauty to be experienced. There's no experience that you can look at your life and be like, oh, I wish I would have had that. I wish that this would have happened to me and not them. But if you truly understand what I'm saying here, there's only a sense of, oh, okay, so this is another expression of me. This is another thing that has happened to me. It is quite wild. But you can also see that this is where empathy comes from. We do understand through empathy that it doesn't really matter that much to whom something is happening. What really matters is that it is happening. And through this understanding, I suffered countless terrible visions. I empathized with terrors of collective suffering, imagining everything that has ever happened in humanity and how horrible it must be to suffer so much, because my own individual suffering as a human is already so much. So this is a crucial component for anybody who really wants to move deep into the nature of reality and to gain some deeper spiritual insights. But it requires to move through a ton of uncomfortable realizations that aren't easy to digest. And most people in society, if you really tell it to them straight, they might call you crazy. So if something in your awareness has shifted while watching this and you feel somewhat unease, I recommend you watch this video next.